Resuming debate, the honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and let me start today by telling you that I represent a riding that's in Treaty 7 territory. They're traditional territories of the Blackfoot Nation, including Siksika, Piikani and Kainai, the Tsuut'ina Nation, and Stoney Nakoda First Nations. We acknowledge all the many First Nations, Métis and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. But let me start today's debate on Bill C-15, introduced to ensure that the laws of Canada are consistent with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, with the questions I am often asked about its clarifications. How is the United Nations involved? How do their edicts fit in Canadian law, which of course is much more robust? How does the United Nations edicts affect jurisdictions that have an established rule of law? How does UNDRIP consider and affect unique constitutional rights like Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution? How do the two go hand in hand? As this is legislation, will it remain subservient to the constitutional law of Canada that supersedes it? What happens to existing Canadian laws? How are decades of legal precedent affected by this declaration? Who will be the decision makers? That is the arbiters to balance the various interests and outcomes of these very pertinent questions. Will it be the same stagnant bureaucrats and interest groups that have ensconced the Indian Act as the status quo, in spite of decades of compulsion from all affected corners of Canada to move beyond this paternalistic legislation? Will it be a star chamber of legalists who have never set foot on the ground or experienced the problems that generations of First Nations have been striving to overcome? One thing is clear, based on outcomes that have not arrived. The status quo is broken. How do we know it's broken? Let me count the ways. The words that describe the rights of Canada's Indigenous people are a meaningful gesture, but gestures themselves are empty. There is no reconciliation that does not include economic reconciliation. Any legislation that we consider must not contribute to any negative impacts on the many Indigenous communities that rely on resource development for jobs, revenues, and a means to better outcomes. The decision makers, bureaucrats, legalists, self-serving interest groups, those with a stake in maintaining the miserable status quo should not be ensconced as roadblocks to the change that Canada requires. It's also worth noting that those with the large stake in the benefits of the status quo have no stake in the misery associated with the status quo, which is borne by those who have been actually seeking to escape that misery for decades. A wholesale change is long overdue, and bringing forth legislation to secure the interests of these regressive middlemen is the opposite of what Canada and its Indigenous population requires. Let me caution the Minister of Justice about placing his faith in the same interest groups and interveners that have been part of the problem on this matter for decades. If the Minister wants to get on the ground and hear about the frustrations with those voices by Indigenous Canadians throughout Canada who will be affected by this legislation and the uncertainty it brings forth, please take the time to meet with those groups and have fulsome consultation, which has not happened, including in this House, where we've had 1 hour of debate prior to today on it. Now, weeks ago, Madam Speaker, I asked questions in this House about the effects of this government's actions on the flight of capital for project development in Canada. Oddly, it was after one of the government's appointees blamed risk and uncertainty as the underlying reasons why projects were no longer being viewed as viable investments by foreign capital in Canada. Of course, rather than addressing the causes of the risk and uncertainty and changing the destructive course on which this government has ventured for 6 years, the solution seems to be for the government to allocate capital to replace private investment. The magic of social finance to the rescue. We know what this means. It means more risk and uncertainty for Canada's taxpayers. What others are recognizing as a problem is going to be a problem for Canadian taxpayers. And the government is doubling down on the risk Canadians will bear. In regards to UNDRIP, this legislation, as written, adds another level of risk and uncertainty to development in Indigenous territories. Prior to this country's battle to get ahead of a pandemic 13 months ago, the biggest issue we were facing as a country and as a cohesive society was the blockades that were initiated by certain Indigenous organizations in support of some parties opposed to the Coastal GasLink pipeline, traversing Wet'suwet'en territory in northern British Columbia. Do we know who these initiators were? Do we know what standing they had? Traditional, authoritative, representative, legal, responsible? Do we know if these parties had other interests in the outcome? What we do know is that the democratic process for the ban matters was completely usurped and endorsed by the Minister of Crown and Indigenous Relations, thus by this government. So, well-understood process, which had changed substantially, was quickly usurped. Do I need to define risk and uncertainty for this government? Whom does this government see having legitimacy in the eyes of project proponents? Definitely not the process as represented. As proponents have attested, if we don't have process, we don't have a path forward. This bill, C-15, proposes to increase that risk and uncertainty for Indigenous organizations and adds another barrier to their participation in economic reconciliation. Even as project proponents themselves attracting real capital for development of their own economic opportunities, they will be thwarted again by this government. Thanks for the words. How about some real actions? Let me illustrate the cost of that uncertainty. Kitimat LNG is a project on Canada's west coast. The project has been progressing for a decade, along with its partner development, the Pacific Trails Pipeline. The project proponents have spent over $3 billion to get to this point, which represents a raft of documentation for the regulators, a gravel pad, and full agreement with all 16 Indigenous organizations traversed by the pipeline, and full partnership with the Haisla First Nation at the project site. Thousands of Indigenous jobs, hundreds of millions of dollars of benefits to people in Indigenous communities, advanced trade training for a generation of people in those communities, the creation of capacity for advancing economic interests. This does not arrive out of thin air. In addition, more than 40 million tons per annum of greenhouse gas reductions that we won't meet. Sadly, at the end of the day, this project is on hold because there is no path forward at this point in time. Putting aside the ancillary environmental benefits, another file in which this government is all talk with little tangible results, economic reconciliation delayed is reconciliation denied. Tell your children after 10 years that the reason they couldn't get a better education and advance their societies, and the world's interests is because the process was obscure and caused a decade of delays, and you will understand the frustration. As I said, the interests advancing this confusion have no stake in the outcome. Let's acknowledge that some of those interests, such as the NGOs that are short-term participants, often funded by foreign actors, have their own interests at heart and are often funded as well by this federal government. Words and actions, Madam Speaker. We hear much of the former from this government. We receive little of the latter. How many Indigenous organizations have to stand up and say to this Minister of Justice, "Justice, we don't think this law will work. We are worried that it adds further to difficulties we have already experienced," before he pays attention, before he gathers consensus, before he shuts down debate in this House of Commons on a fundamental piece of legislation that will change our country's governance going forward, including with those groups we are constitutionally bound to consider under Section 35 of Canada's Constitution. We've seen this minister in action. Yes, action. Bill C7, medical assistance in dying. Let me remind the House that we moved this bill through this House, and on this side of the House, many of my colleagues supported the government's legislation before it went to the Senate. This minister manipulated that legislation in the other place and brought it back here in an entirely different form that ignored the at-risk groups that were left behind in that legislation. As a result, we had to move against it. That represents manipulation, so we did vote against that process. It is not democratic, Madam Speaker. Does this minister believe that First Nation organizations have not recognized his actions? Does he think they are unnecessarily wary of his non-democratic tendencies and his partiality to other interested parties? I will repeat again. There are many moving this legislation forward that have no stake in the outcome. That spells moral hazard, and we must avert it. Real outcomes, accountability, trust. These are in short supply with this government. We must do better.
Comments? The honourable member Who's up there? I can't see who that is. The honourable member for Hastings, Lennox Addington.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate the comments of the member across. And I appreciated him talking about uncertainty and with respect to these protests and blockades. And I wanted to ask him about a blockade that occurred in my riding. There was a famous blockade that occurred in Ontario and central Canada that lasted for 3 weeks, and it impacted many billions of dollars worth of commerce. I spoke to the local chief of that nation in my riding. He told me, and we were trying to think of a way to maybe end this blockade. He told me that many protesting would not heed his calls to remove the blockade because they did not respect his title of chief under the Indian Act. These individuals claimed that they themselves held hereditary rights to the chief role. And I'd like to ask the member if he believes that C-15 would make this type of scenario more likely to occur in the future. Thank you.
The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank my colleague for that question. It's a very important question because I have met with Indigenous organizations in my riding and across Canada. And one of the exact issues that they brought forward is who has standing to say that I give this veto, you need my consent in order to move this forward. And does that consent now come at the high school level when every person has to step forward? Does it come with an actual legitimacy? So we have experienced that across the country, and it has been brought to our attention that this is a fundamental that has to change. We have to recognize who actually has the authority to give that consent or withhold that consent at the end of the day. And that's not clear at all in this bill. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Séance de commentaires, l'honorable député de Beauport-Limoilou.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Vous savez, l'autodétermination implique qu'on soit en mesure de dire oui ou non à un projet. Ça implique aussi qu'il est clair de savoir qui a l'autorité pour le faire. Malheureusement, il y a une loi qui s'appelle la loi des Indiens, qui est une loi fondamentalement raciste par ses concepts, par son archaïsme. C-15 veut une réconciliation. Est-ce que mon collègue croit que pour une réconciliation complète, claire, il faut aussi changer la loi sur les Indiens?
The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Vraiment, merci Madame la Présidente. Je suis d'accord avec mon collègue. Oui, je suis seulement fier de parler ici de les contraintes maintenant de l'Acte des Indiens du Canada. Il faut qu'il change maintenant. Peut-être il faut qu'il n'existe pas. On verra dans le prochain Parlement, j'espère. Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Brief question. The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his intervention. He's somebody from my neck of the woods, I suppose, and someone I consider a friend. I miss being able to talk with him in the lobby and share our different perspectives. I wanted to talk to him about a specific Alberta issue right now. So in Alberta at the moment, he will know there is a lot of debate around coal mining and about mountaintop coal mining. And I have worked quite closely with Indigenous groups in southern Alberta to help them protect their rights, to work with them to ensure their rights are protected. You know, they brought forward a petition that had 18,000 signatures that were calling on the government to protect treaty and Aboriginal rights, water rights, species at risk rights, and the environment. And I'm just wondering why he feels that implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People would not provide more clarity, more certainty for investment decisions, not less. By involving Indigenous people in the beginning of the project, it seems to me that would make it even stronger, an even stronger proposition. Could he comment on that?
I just want to remind members to make sure that their mics are off. The honourable member of Calgary Centre.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and yes, I will comment on that. The coal development that they're looking at that has been petitioned in southern Alberta has been in the process for over 8 years. I think 2013 it started, so it's transcended different provincial governments and indeed different federal governments and has a multi-party, multi-level of government environmental assessment review going on at this point in time. It's important to make sure that we bring everybody in at the front of the line, but have a process that's involved that actually says, here's where we get input from all of the different actors or interests that are involved in any type of natural resource project development, especially coal mines. I know that I understand that the provincial government is looking at that very clearly and looking at potentially reverting back to a policy that's been in the works, was actually existed back to the time of Premier Lougheed, and a very good piece of legislation that makes sure we protected those interests and the nature that we need to uphold, especially in the Rocky Mountains, eastern slopes. Thank you.